Kavam and Azerbaijan, Soviet encroachments, and Queen Fawzia must have all seemed paltry to the Shah as he sat bleeding, very slowly, in the back of his limousine around 1:30 in the afternoon of a cold, rainy day on February 4th, 1949. Dr. Manukher Iqbal, once a protege of Kavam's and a key player in the Shah's successfully orchestrated mass resignation of Kavam's ministers, was in the car attending to the wound. Dr. Iqbal had been at Tehran University as the Minister of Health and as a part of the Shah's official welcoming committee. The Shah had arrived at the university around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Earlier that day he had gone skiing, a lifelong passion he had developed while studying in Switzerland, and he was now visiting Tehran University's Faculty of Law and Political Science. The establishment of this school had been, according to the Ayatollah Khomeini, a near mortal blow to the power and prestige of the clergy in Iran. It deprived them of their lucrative monopoly control of the judiciary and of the courts. We should have opposed the school's establishment, Ayatollah Khomeini would say more than once in his life. The Shah was in fact coming to the university to celebrate the anniversary of the law school's foundation. But that February afternoon, as the Shah, dressed in his military uniform and wearing a heavy overcoat, stepped out of his car, a black Rolls-Royce, that day a man whose thoughts and ideas were not dissimilar to those of Ayatollah Khomeini was waiting in the area set aside for journalists and photographers. His name was Nasser Fakhari, and the camera case he carried gave him the appearance of a photographer. But what he had come to shoot that day was not a photograph. As the Shah neared the steps leading to the law school building, Fakhari, standing near the steps, pulled out a revolver he had hidden inside the camera case and began to shoot at the Shah point blank. He was nervous. His hands shook. He had been planning for this moment for at least 3 years. The fact that the Shah was left with no protection after the first shot afforded Fakhari no help. Upon hearing the first shot, the head of the Shah's security detail hit the pavement and crawled to safety under the Rolls-Royce. Members of the welcoming team all took refuge inside the building. The assassin's first 3 bullets only grazed the Shah's hat. The 4th bullet entered his cheek and exited from his upper lip. Several of his front teeth were knocked out. A set of false teeth to replace the damaged ones was quickly made for him. The fact that he used them became henceforth something of a state secret. Only a few trusted members of his immediate family knew of their existence. An occasional, slightly audible hiss was the only hint of the false teeth's existence. By the time the 4th bullet pierced the Shah's lip, the assassin had only 2 left in his revolver's chamber. There is something cinematic in the Shah's description of what happened next. "There we stood, facing each other," he writes, "with no one between us. I knew there was no reason why the next bullet won't hit me. I fully remember my reaction in those split seconds. I thought maybe I should jump him, but then realized that such a move will make me an easier target. And if I try to escape, I figured he will shoot me in the back." Left with no good alternatives, the Shah decided on what he called a series of acrobatic moves, employing a military tactic to confound the shooter. He describes how he moved to the right and then to the left, and how he swayed forward and backward, all in a few split seconds. His description is like watching a film where the bullet's motion has been slowed to a crawl. The next bullet, the Shah writes, wounded my shoulders. There was now only one bullet left. So far, the assassin's failure of marksmanship, or the Shah's agility of movement, had saved him. What would save him now? The last bullet jammed in the chamber, the Shah writes. The assassin angrily threw his revolver at the Shah and ran toward the grassy knoll a few steps away. There is a photo of the Shah moments after he failed the assassination attempt. He is still on his feet and has pulled out a handkerchief and is using it to sop and wipe away the blood. A few feet from the grass were the campus walls, a gate, and a throng of curious, frightened observers. Fakhari was headed in that direction, but before he could reach the gate, soldiers jumped on him. Some say he had fallen, allowing the soldiers to catch up with him easily. "Kill the son of a bitch!" cried General Morteza Khan Yazdanpaneh, a trusted military aide to the Shah. By then, the assassin was no longer armed, save for a small knife, shown in published pictures with a caption indicating it was hidden inside his sock. Within minutes of the failed attempt on the Shah's life, rifle butts and bullets fired point blank had killed Fakhari. In his pocket, the guards found his identity card showing he had gained access to the area as a staff photographer for a paper called Parkam-e-Islam, or Flag of Islam. In the paranoid world of Iranian politics, the questionable decision of the Shah's guards to kill the assassin led to a plethora of conspiracy theories, including one that implicated those at the scene. They were complicit in the act, people whispered, and lest the assassin talk and reveal their secrets, they killed him. Another theory pointed an accusing finger at General Razmara. Like a ghost hunting the halls of power, his hand was seen behind every major event in the country in those days, and few things were as major as an attempt on the life of the Shah. Razmara was by then one of the most powerful generals in the Iranian military. His political ambition was an open secret. His ties to the Soviet Union and to the Tudeh party were grist to many rumor mills. His romantic ties to Princess Ashraf afforded him special access to the court and the Shah. These factors, and the fact that he was conspicuously absent from the ranks of dignitaries gathered at the university to welcome the Shah, combined to make him a suspect. The Shah's own description of the assassin's connections exemplifies his proclivity for conspiracy theories. It became clear later, he wrote, that he had connections to some religious zealots, and also there was some evidence of his connection to the dissolved Tudeh party. It is also interesting that the assassin's girlfriend was the daughter of the gardener at the British Embassy. As it turned out, the assassin had, some months earlier, taken up with a woman called Mahin Eslami, and her father did indeed work at the embassy. But Fakhari had also been trying to kill the Shah long before the romance began. A few hours after the assassination attempt, the royal court and the government both issued communiques describing the incident. As expected, keen on using the occasion to the Shah's political benefit, the court communique quoted what is suggested were the Shah's first words after surgery. To serve the country and the beloved nation. A few bullets count for naught, and my resolve in reaching our goals remains intact. The government communique talked of a widening conspiracy of traitors keen on undermining the foundations of the nation's security. In recent months, it said, these traitors had been emboldened in their treachery. They commenced by spreading vicious rumors against the Shah, that most sacred official of the country, and finally their audacity reached a level wherein one of the traitors took aim at the most sacred of all sacred authorities in the country, a person who embodies Iran's national identity and is the foundation of the country's independence. Around 7 in the evening, the Shah delivered a short message on the radio. His picture in a checkered hospital gown with a bandage around his mouth became iconic, and the Shah's supporters praised it for capturing his stoic heroism. In his radio message, the Shah first thanked the infinite grace and goodness of the good Lord, who saved him from the assassination attempt, and then went on to thank the people for their profuse show of support. He ended by promising to give life and limb in the service of safeguarding the nation and securing the welfare of the people. Though the assassin had been a religious zealot, active with Islamic radicals opposed to the Shah, the Tudeh party was blamed for the masterminding the assassination attempt. In reality, Fakhari, a confused young man angry at the world and at the Shah, had been a childhood friend of a member of the party, a nondescript young man called Abdullah Arghani. For several years, Fakhari had been talking to Arghani about his plans to kill the Shah. In 1946, 3 years before the day he nearly succeeded, he had forged for himself an identity card that showed him to be a photojournalist for Parkam-e-Islam. Fakhari had made his first attempt to kill the Shah in 1946, when the latter had traveled to the city of Isfahan. Fakhari apparently never came close enough to take a shot. On that trip, the Shah was accompanied by Parvin Ghaffari, in those days rumored to be his favorite paramour. The affair was hardly a well-kept secret. A few years later, one of Iran's most prolific writers of popular romance novels serialized a story he called Our Town's Blonde. It was something of a roman éclair, particularly in its early parts, chronicling the blonde's affairs with a character who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Shah. During Fawzia's absence from the country, the Shah was often seen with her, including the 1946 journey to Isfahan. Fakhari's second failed attempt was made a few months later when the Shah was watching a tennis match in Amjadai, the city's only stadium at the time. Once again, the assailant did not get close enough to shoot. From his days in Switzerland, tennis had been one of the Shah's favorite pastimes, and he had built a tennis court in one of his palaces. Tehran papers at the time marveled at the fact that the tennis court was sufficiently lit that it allowed the Shah to play a game at night if he wanted to. They wrote of his regular matches with some of the country's top players. On each of these 2 failed assassination attempts, Fakhari had shared his plans with his childhood friend Abdullah Arghani, who was by then a member of the Tudeh party. Arghani had shared his information with Nur al-Din Kianori, one of the Tuta party's top leaders. As soon as Kianori learned of Fakhari's plans, he discussed the matter with the party Politburo. The committee summarily dismissed the idea as adventuralism and terrorism and ordered Kianori to cease all contacts with the assassin. But Kianori considered himself one of the true revolutionaries in the party, otherwise dominated by reformists, and thus he refused to follow the party leader's decision, continuing the contacts with Fakhari, even going so far as helping to provide him with a revolver. As a result, when the assassination attempt at Tehran University took place, the Shah and the police, keen on blaming the communists and planning to use the charge of complicity in the attack to declare the party illegal, had just enough threads to connect the communists to the assassination attempt. Not long after the two official communiques following the shooting at the university, the government declared martial law. A special session of the Majlis was convened that night, and the Tuta party was declared illegal, a decision the government proved unable or unwilling to implement. Before midnight, on the day of the failed assassination attempt, 28 of the party's top leaders were arrested. But for the next 4 years, in spite of the government decrees banning and dissolving the party, it continued to operate, even thrive, through its many front organizations. While divine intervention and acrobatic military tactics were, in the Shah's mind, what had saved him from the assassin's bullets, a few months earlier he had almost lost his life in a flying accident. In those years, his political and emotional life was fraught with bleak realities. But a bright spot had come in September of 1946 when he officially received his pilot's license. Ever since Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate in the 1940 U.S. presidential election, had come to Tehran in 1942 and given the Shah a ride over the capital in his private jet, flying had become a passion in the Shah's life. Going up in the air with Willkie gave the Shah such pleasure that he wanted to stay up indefinitely. Only when Willkie insisted that landing at night might be difficult did he agree to land. In a strange twist of fate, the Shah almost decided to avoid the meeting. Willkie, who suffered from athlete's foot, had, in his earlier meeting with Kavem, taken off his shoes to scratch his toes. Kavem also suspected that Willkie had allowed himself the luxury and liberty of freeing himself noisily of superfluous bodily gases, while discussing urgent matters of state with the Prime Minister. Lest he repeat his audacity of noisy shoelessness in a formal royal audience, Kavem had suggested, rather cryptically, that the Shah must cancel his meeting with Willkie. The Shah ignored the warning, as he distrusted Kavem's motives. The meeting took place with no incident, and one result was the Shah's exposure to piloting and planes. In spite of his demure and invariably cautious public demeanor, the Shah had a lifelong passion for the reckless abandon of a speeding car, a fast motorcycle, or an airplane. After the flyover with Wendell Willkie, the Shah hired an American TWA captain by the name of Dick Calbarn to teach him how to fly. The American State Department had only one piece of advice for Kalbarn as he set out for his new duties. The Shah was not to get killed. Arriving at the court, the captain was particularly surprised by the fact that the Shah must have 25 custom-built cars, Buicks, Cadillacs, 6 Rolls-Royces, and a Mercedes. The Shah, the captain concluded, was an apt flying student. He taught the Shah how to fly British model planes, like the Anson and Hurricane, and the American models like the Beechcraft. Eventually, the Shah fell in love with a B-17 plane he had seen in Tehran. He started to bicker for it and eventually bought it sometime in early 1947. The price is not known. The Shah's passion for flying and for speed almost cost him his life many times. In 1944, for example, he was flying his small single-engine plane to a place called Kurang near Isfahan. A general was the only passenger. Hardly 10 minutes into the flight, without any rhyme or reason, the engine went dead, forcing the Shah to make an emergency landing in a narrow zigzag ravine full of rocks and cliffs. The maneuvers forced the plane into a somersault, and it came to a halt upside down, with both the Shah and his passenger hanging upside down from their seats. While the plane accident had no impact on the nation's public mood towards the Shah, the failed assassination attempt afforded him a flood of sympathy and became a useful tool for realizing one of his main goals in the first decade of his rule. From his first days in office, he was, in the words of the British Embassy, hankering after more power, telling anyone who would listen, particularly the British and American ambassadors, more than once that the only solution to Iran's problems was for him to have more power. More specifically, he wanted the power to dissolve an unsatisfactory parliament. But these attempts were repeatedly met with either the stiff resistance of Iranian political forces or pushback from the British and American embassies. Both embassies believed an increase in the Shah's constitutional power would lead to a system of one-man rule, and they had both concluded that the Shah's past behavior did not inspire confidence in such a rule. In explaining their opposition to the Shah's proposal, they told him that no European monarch has constitutional power to initiate dissolution of parliament except Sweden, where such power has not been used in the past 25 years. From early 1948, the question of changing the Constitution and increasing his power became something of an obsession for the Shah. Even in the eyes of George Allen, the American ambassador, who was usually sympathetic to the Shah, he had begun to show almost alarming preoccupation with the question of constitutional change. Throughout 1948, the Shah used every occasion to convince the British and American embassies about the wisdom, indeed the dire necessity, of his proposed constitutional change. By then, he had found more than a few Iranian politicians willing to support his plans. During the month of October of that year, he threatened that he would abdicate, if he did not receive the extra powers he demanded. At about the same time, he offered to give the Majlis a 4-month ultimatum to approve his proposal, otherwise he would resign. The American embassy still tried to dissuade the Shah from his plans, telling him that foreign policy and national defense were already firmly in his hands, and that seeking more power was unwise. Moreover, the embassy advised the Shah strongly against the idea of using the threat of abdication. When the Shah decided he could not convince the American and British embassies about the wisdom of his plans, he decided to proceed and not to heed American and British advice against the idea. Faced with the Shah's intractable position, both embassies changed their minds and decided to support the idea. Ironically, Tehran was in those days rife with rumors that the Shah's decision to increase his power was an order issued by the British. Their only suggestion was that, concurrently with the revision of the Constitution, the Shah would also demand the establishment of the Senate. The 1905 Constitution had called for the creation of such an institution, but it had never been established. By early April 1949, the Shah finally succeeded in convening an amenable Constituent Assembly for the specific purpose of changing the Constitution, augmenting his own power and diluting the power and independence of the Majlis. In his speech to the opening session of the Assembly, after conjuring the sacred and unchangeable principles of the beneficent faith of Islam, the Shah told the members that after contemplating the problems of the country over the last few years, he had concluded that the most elemental cause of the country's problems had been an imbalance between the powers of the three branches of government. A new constitutional amendment augmenting the power of his office would, he said, allow the country to find its place amongst the genuine democracies of the world, and allow the government to work for a more just and equitable distribution of wealth in the country. But the argument was specious at best. Constitutional experts have long argued that in a democracy where checks and balances between the three branches diminish the possibility of despotism, the power of the executive to dissolve the parliament can be democratic only if, in the process of dissolution, the fate of the executive is put to a new vote. In the absence of such provision, the right to dissolve the parliament leads to despotism. In the case of Iran, the carefully picked Constituent Assembly not only gave the Shah the power to dissolve the Majlis at will, but also called for the creation of a Senate, a body composed of 60 senators, 30 of whom were appointed by the Shah, thus affording him yet another mechanism with which to influence the legislative process and dilute the power of the popularly elected Majlis. Opposition to the Shah's plans to increase his power was not limited to Western embassies. Many in Iran, particularly amongst the opposition, also spoke against the proposed change. None, however, spoke as frankly and as prophetically as Kavem. From Paris he wrote a missive in the form of an open letter to the Shah, accusing him of breaching the constitution and usurping powers that even a despot like Muhammad Ali Shah, notorious for trying to roll back every democratic component of the constitutional revolution, had not dared claim for himself. Such a power grab, Kavem predicted, would have dire consequences for the Shah. The Shah did not deign to respond, but had his court minister, Ibrahim Hakimi, write a bitter letter accusing Kavem of treason and of conspiring with the Soviets in the Azerbaijan crisis. Moreover, Kavem was stripped of the title of Hazrati Ashraf. Kazim wrote back in a no less defiant tone, reminding the Shah of the letter he had written commending Kazim for his work in solving the Azerbaijan crisis. True to form, Kazim went on to claim that he and no one else was responsible for the solution of that crisis. Fool should have realized he was no longer useful. Iranian papers at the time were ordered to publish only the Shah's response, not either of Kazim's angry epistles. Parallel to the tumult in his public life, the Shah's private life too was undergoing profound changes. On one hand, Queen Fawzia still refused to return home. The Shah had made numerous gestures of reconciliation. In those days, he confided to the British embassy, in his mind, the Queen Mother is probably the main obstacle to the return of the Queen. So disturbed was the Shah about his mother's interferences that he compared her to Kazim, complaining that his position is becoming increasingly delicate between an experienced and ambitious prime minister on the one hand and a vindictive and domineering mother on the other. Together, he said, they have reduced me to an insignificant role. A pussy. Anyway, according to sources in Cairo, the real reason for Fawzia's refusal to return was not only the Queen Mother, but also a Persian lady with whom the Shah had an affair. Tehran was in those days a small town and was awash with rumors of the Shah's flings, of sightings of the Shah cavorting around town in one of his several fancy convertibles with a young Persian lady at his side. Of these, the most infamous was Parvin Ghaffari, whose infinite appetite for gossip and self-adulation is evident in the salacious memoir she was allowed, some say forced, to publish after the Islamic Revolution. Ultimately, the British decided not to burn their fingers in trying to mediate between the Shah and his estranged queen. Aside from the blonde paramour, there was talk of wild parties and high-stakes poker games at the court. None of these rumors were likely to encourage the British to intercede or the Queen to return to Tehran. With their customary caution, British officials knew what every wise man or woman knows: trying to mediate between estranged couples can only earn one the dislike of both parties. Learning of the British reluctance to mediate, the Shah decided to send his own emissary to Cairo. It was known that King Farouk was against the idea of his sister's return. The reason for the opposition was not known, of course. The Shah's twin sister claims that Farouk's unrequited love for her was one of the main reasons. No sooner had Ashraf met Farouk, who was by then already married, than he started talking about love and marriage. When she turned him down, Ashraf claims he took up with another woman and was bent on divorcing his wife. And wanting to avoid being the first Muslim king to divorce his wife, Farouk, in this rather fantastic story, ordered his sister to divorce her husband. In reality, by then many Muslim kings, including Princess Ashraf's own father, had divorced their wives many a time. But regardless of the reason, Fawzia refused to come back, and the Shah wanted to at least appear to have made a serious effort to bring her back, and therefore sent a special emissary. He chose Dr. Kazim Ghani for the job. He was a respected physician and scholar who had been part of the party sent in 1939 to bring the newly betrothed Fawzia to Iran. According to Dr. Ghani, he had all but convinced Fawzia to return when suddenly she received a letter from Iran. No sooner had she read the letter than she announced her categorical decision not to return to Iran. By then she had been estranged from her daughter for several months, and even the idea of seeing her child again was not enough for an enticement. Many have suggested that the Shah's mother was the author of the letter, while others point to one of the Shah's sisters who had earlier, in a fit of anger, broken a vase over Fawzia's head. The content of the letter is not known, but it is rumored to include a lurid account of the Shah's continued philandering. In those days, the British embassy in Cairo was told that the reason for the divorce was that the Shah, besides being much preoccupied with a Persian lady, wishes to marry a Persian woman and get a son wholly Persian. One reason the Shah was keen on having Fawzia back was to stop the spread of damaging rumors in Tehran about the real reason of the Queen's departure. While Fawzia was in Tehran, the Shah, ever busy with his own philandering, had asked a close friend, what an idiot, a member of his inner circle to keep the Queen company. Whispers in Tehran had it that an unexpected emotional attachment had developed between the keeper, a handsome, athletic young man, and his ward. Many who know Fawzia best dismiss these allegations as nothing short of vicious rumors. She is a lady, her son-in-law, Ardashir Zahidi, said, and never veered from the path of purity and fidelity. Finally, on November 17, 1947, what had been till then an open secret in Tehran took on the authority of fact when an official communiqué announced the dissolution of the Shah's marriage to Queen Fawzia. The weather, it turned out, was the real culprit. The Queen, it said, had left Iran 3 years ago after a long ailment, and on the orders of her physician, who believed a change of climate would help her heal faster. Now, the same doctors had, according to the communiqué, decided that Tehran's weather is damaging to her health, and forbade her to return. Never was weather imbued with such a rich array of metaphorical meanings. Because of this climactic exigency, His Royal Majesty has decided that she should forego returning to Tehran. The marriage, by mutual accord, was dissolved. With the luxury of hindsight, writing in his 1961 memoirs, the Shah offers an altogether different reason for his divorce. It was, the Shah writes, her inability to produce a son that caused the breakup. He writes of the birth of a beloved... Well, if you're not attracted to your wife, you're not going to... Anyway. He writes of the birth of a beloved daughter, Princess Shahnaz, as the only happy light moment of his marriage to Fawzia, adding that for reasons that are still not clear, Princess Fawzia could not produce a male child, in spite of the doctor's concentrated efforts, and thus, pressured by my advisors, when Fawzia returned to Egypt, we decided to divorce. In a strange twist of fate, a few years later, when Fawzia did remarry, that time to an Egyptian man, their first and only child was a boy. See? Whatever the reason for the divorce in 1947, the daily grind of his ongoing political battles was making the Shah often look tired and spent, Someone who needed a complete change to cut himself off for a while from the intrigues that surrounded him. To those who saw him in those days, he seemed like a pathetic figure, but sympathetic, if one could feel that there was anything solid there. Events since the end of the Second World War had certainly tested the solidity of his character. The next few years would test it even further.